Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of Deviance and Social Control. Today we're going to do an analysis, no, we're going to do the take two. Today we're going to do an analysis of deviance in film. Let's get started.
When analyzing deviance in film, you can focus on a lot of different types of and responses to deviance. But let's say that you're interested in analyzing deviance in Disney's Dumbo, since we all already know that this is a story about an outcast elephant. I will analyze manifestations of deviance as discussed by Irving Goffman in Stigma, Notes on the Management of a Spoiled Identity. Goffman defined manifestations of deviance as a stigma, bodily signs designed to expose something different or unusual. These signs usually affect the moral status of the signifier, the person being stigmatized, the deviant person. That is, having one of these signs that you are stigmatized makes people think of you as morally bad or just not good enough. So Disney's Dumbo is a great film to use to analyze stigma and the response to stigma. First, according to Goffman, all of us have a virtual social identity. These are the assumptions people make about us based mostly on what they see. People assume they know something of our character based on their first impression. This is not necessarily the same as our actual social identity, which are those characteristics that we can prove we possess. So, for example, in Dumbo, we are introduced to a baby elephant. Everyone oohs and ahs over the cute baby elephant, complimenting the mother and talking about what a great elephant he will become. That's Dumbo's virtual social identity. And Goffman argues that stigma can be visible or it can be hidden. When the deviance is evident, and this usually means that it's visible, that is a discredited stigma. On the other hand, the deviance could be hidden. Goffman called this a discreditable stigma. In the case of Dumbo, his stigma is initially discreditable. It's hidden. His ears are hidden behind his back. But once he trips over his ears and they pop out, he becomes discredited. So Goffman discussed several stigmas that were discrediting or discreditable, and those include abominations of the body, which are physical differences or deformities, blemishes of individual character, and those are traits that are perceived as being the result of weak will or domineering or unnatural passions or treacherous or rigid beliefs. Dishonesty, those are blemishes of individual character. And then Goffman talked about tribal stigma. Those are stigmas attached to race, nation, religion, and those are all transmitted usually through lineage, and they affect every member of a family or a group. Goffman described those of us who do not possess these kinds of socially discrediting characteristics as normals. Normals negatively respond to the stigmatized, which causes certain predictable responses on the part of the stigmatized. So in the case of Dumbo, we are going to be talking about the abominations of the body category discussed by Goffman. These are physical differences that are seen as deviant from some idealized, quote unquote, normal. And we'll use Dumbo for this example, but if we wanted to focus on abominations of the body, we could have used Hunchback of Notre Dame, we could have used Nemo from Finding Nemo, or even the Beast from Beauty and the Beast. But we're using Dumbo. Dumbo starts with setting the expectations of normals. We watch as storks deliver happy little babies to all the animals in the circus, all except the unhappy mama elephant, Mrs. Jumbo. When she finally does get her precious Jumbo Jr., we learn that he was born with a physical deformity, those giant ears. The first act of stigmatizing baby Jumbo Jr. is when the other elephants start calling him Dumbo. And that sets the scene to see him as different than the other elephants. But at the beginning of the movie, at that point of the movie, Dumbo sees nothing wrong with who he is or his big ears. According to Goffman and the theory of stigma management, the stigmatized recognize that normals see their difference in a negative light. Both the stigmatizers and the stigmatized typically respond in a number of predictable ways. As the film unfolds, the normals respond to Dumbo in a number of ways to let him know he is stigmatized. In one scene, he's ridiculed, ostracized, and teased by people attending the circus. Goffman also discusses the way responding to the stigmatized creates categories of us and them, which he calls the own and the wise. The own are insiders. They're members of the stigmatized group. Goffman says that the stigmatized may seek out other similar others, which allows the stigmatized to have a shared basis for organizing, but then they are removed from full social participation. This isn't particularly a great fit for Dumbo because there are no others like him, but he does get pushed out of full social participation in the life of an elephant in the circus. He becomes a clown. The film does give us an example of outsiders who become what Goffman calls the wise. These are people who understand and sympathize with the stigmatized and who often get stigmatized themselves. This is the group of normals who are privy to the secret life of the stigmatized. Often, this group of normals have to pass through a heart-changing personal experience. This is best illustrated when Mrs. Jumbo, who loves her outcast son, attempts to protect Dumbo from ridicule and teasing by throwing people and objects around. She just kind of goes nuts. And for sympathizing with the stigmatized, for trying to protect Dumbo, Mrs. Jumbo is imprisoned in a solitary confinement cage with labels like mad elephant and danger and keep out on it. The other elephants shame her for acting out. There's an interesting bit in this scene about gender in the other elephants' reaction to Mrs. Jumbo, with some arguing that one mustn't forget one is a lady, and then others saying that Mrs. Jumbo's violent outburst was permissible because it was an expression of a mother's love. But ultimately, the other elephants blame Dumbo for Mrs. Jumbo's behavior. They say things like, his disgrace is our own shame. And then they start really shunning him, physically blocking him out from the group and saying things like, pretend you don't see him. That is another response to stigmatization. And to alleviate their discomfort, normals may pretend the stigmatized or their stigma doesn't exist, that the stigmatized is a non-person. As part of the theory of stigma management, Goffman argued that the stigmatized respond in particular ways as well. Goffman says the stigmatized can respond by what's called defensive cowering or hostile bravado. And we see this when Dumbo hides away from the other animals, in the defensive cowering anyway. Dumbo doesn't engage in a lot of hostile bravado. Dumbo's hiding away from other animals can also be seen as an example of avoidance. Goffman argues that, such isolation, this avoidance can create depression or hostility. And Goffman seems very depressed. I mean, Goffman doesn't seem depressed. That's silly. Dumbo seems very depressed as he withdraws. Goffman argued that the stigmatized may come to see their stigma as a quote-unquote blessing in disguise. Goffman talked about this as framing the normals as being limited in their understanding or experience of the world. Like normals are plain and limited, and the stigmatized actually have something special and wonderful. Now, in the case of Dumbo, the mouse tells Dumbo how special he is for having big ears, saying lots of famous people have big ears. The mouse says that they should play up the ears to make Dumbo a star, a headliner. This could also illustrate another response to stigmatization that Goffman discusses, the unconventional interpretation of a stigmatized identity. So instead of being a liability, having big ears is an advantage in a circus show. Of course, in the movie, that doesn't go so well. We see that having a deformity is actually a liability, and Dumbo is given an even lower status. He becomes a clown. We see Dumbo exhibit another response to stigmatization, the internalization or self-hate. He begins to feel bad about himself. and agreeing with the rest of the elephants that he is weird and wrong and bad. Dumbo continues to be ridiculed and shunned until he can show his stigma is ultimately beneficial for the circus. So, spoiler alert, by the end, he becomes a big famous flying elephant because of his big giant ears. So that's it. That's the concept of stigma, the various components of stigma, and the theory of stigma management as applied to cute little Dumbo.
All right, well, that's it. That's all for me. I'll see you next time.